Annyeong. Good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I want to say thank you to the organizers, Korea Startup Forum, and also the Ministry of Economy and Finance for having us here today. Maybe if we start. So I'd like to share with you this afternoon the Malaysian perspective on unicorn growth, but specifically around the ICT and digital economy sectors. Representing Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation, we are the government agency charged with the caretake or development of digital economy as we know now in Malaysia. And to give context to this, I wanted to share with you really our journey as a country since the 1960s into what is now well regarded globally as the digital economy. So Malaysia really started as primarily a commodities economy. We were producing a lot of agriculture and commodities. We moved into a phase in the 70s where we invested largely into manufacturing. I think this is a similar story to the South Korean transition. And around the mid-1990s, our then Prime Minister, who happens to be the Prime Minister again now, had a vision that we would transform into what he at that point called the knowledge-based economy, where it's not just about the machinery that we bring in, but really adding value to the human capital so that we can start doing higher value jobs. So the knowledge-based, innovation-driven economy is really the starting point of what we, in the late 90s, called the Malaysia Multimedia Super Corridor project. Back then in the 90s, nobody called it the internet, people called it the Multimedia Super Highway. Multimedia was, by and large, the first area where technology disrupted. I think if you remember back then, that's when you were probably looking at different forms of media through your Netscape or Netscape browser or Internet Explorer. But over time, and there's no distinct point in the past that we transformed from ICT as a vertical or an industry vertical to a cross-sector movement called digital economy. But what we have come to realize is that this specific sector, as it's recognized in our economy, is moving much faster than the rest of our country. So, in fact, today in 2018, or rather last year's figures, digital economy, which is by and large ICT contribution of supply, manufacturing, and export, together with e-commerce, account for about 18.5% of our GDP. And it's probably got a faster growth rate than the rest of the economy. So we know that there's something there, that's something meaningful, and something that we have to double down on. So how do we look at the digital economy today in Malaysia? Really, it's about the transactions that create value through the adoption of technology. And we understand, if I get this right, so really where we've been playing for the last 20 years is on the supply side. We've been developing the industry largely around ICT to kind of attract investments from overseas, from Korean companies, Japanese companies, American companies, European companies, to start manufacturing and also then serving out to the world. Manufacturing products, but also building out supply chains to provide services to the world. So our key target has always been export volume by creation of products and services in ICT and digital economy. And now we realize that now we have to start looking at the demand side. And here really we look at government as not just the public sector, but as one large company, the government as a consumer of technology. How will the government evolve if they are to adopt and adapt to technology? We look at obviously the businesses using some of our local products and also using global products and services to better their businesses. And now most recently, we're very concerned about how that translates to the everyday man and woman. How does their life change by adopting an e-wallet? How does their life change or become much better enabled if they don't have to buy a car and they can just use a Grab or an Uber? So a lot of technology impacts our lives right now, whether we realize it or not, because I think for the current generation, technology is really second nature. They're born as what we call digital natives. They don't see a difference between how you used to get a car or a cab in the past versus how you can just do it over your phone today. It's just a given because that's the only reality they know. And of course, in doing that, we understand that there's a set of enablers that we have to be able to put in the right place at the right time. And this is largely a big challenge for government. Just to give you an example, when we look at data, I think similar to most countries, we inherit a situation on data governance and policy which was not designed for the internet. So just in Malaysia, for example, there are 19 ministries or agencies which have some say over how data is used. Within government, we have what we call the Official Secrets Act. And if you translate it down to the humans that actually have to operate within these processes, if they don't know whether something is important or secret, it becomes a secret. When it becomes a secret, it cannot be shared publicly, and so businesses cannot use that information. But also on the private sector side, we have the PDPA, the data protection. And similarly with businesses, you now have also commercial concern of should you even share your data out? If you share your data out, do you dilute the value internally, and do you open yourself to exposure from outside parties or competition? So what we have, similar to a lot of countries, is that we have data protection, but we don't have data liberalization. How data can be shared in a meaningful way, safe for the businesses, that limits our exposure, but increases the utility so that businesses can use it to make worthwhile products and services that people can use. And this is a similar story across other parts of infrastructure. So knowing that, we looked at what technology actually does. Because sometimes as you go through the journey, you only feel the incremental changes. It's never that easy to look back and see how technology has really transformed our lives. So Cyberjaya, where my office is based, and as I said, MDEC, we've led the ICT transformation for the country, used to look like this 23 years ago. So palm oil, as I said, was a huge commodity. It still is today for Malaysia. And where my office sits right now, probably used to be occupied by a couple of trees. But today, we have some global giants, from the HPs to the Dells to even Samsung, occupying office spaces that used to be plantations, which now enable a real data and ICT-based economy. So we learned over the years that there are various factors that contribute to this, and there are some factors that we can influence very well and have control over. So number one is global visibility, and that's something that we did very well, or rather, my predecessors, 23 years, did very well in 1996. We announced to the world that our country had this vision to go from manufacturing to ICT and knowledge base, and so global players took notice, and then we had to facilitate and basically speak to the customer. At that point, we had to ask the companies, what would be meaningful for you to come to Malaysia? We had to ensure that whenever they came, there was some part of knowledge sharing or knowledge transfer, because that's the only way that we can actually increase the value creation and the high value job for our people. You wouldn't learn a lot of these things just by reading it in a textbook or going to a university to learn how to run an IT company. You'd have to get a job in an IT company and slowly be able to learn the skills. So then we concentrated really on where the government plays a role to create a conducive business environment. We continue to attract investments, and by that, we don't just mean money, but also companies to come in so that we can actually have the right set of parameters for them to be able to set up their operations in Malaysia. We continue to think about their ease of doing business. Many companies come from another country that have very differing laws. I think even today, when we have some of our friends from Thailand and Indonesia, the process of starting a business or starting a legal entity is different from country to country. So we take that into account, depending on where they come from, on how do you translate that into something which is much easier for them coming into a foreign country like Malaysia. And of course, from there, as we build the value chain, we try to promote for our local entrepreneurs to build businesses within these value chains. As government, we continue to invest in a lot of the enablers, the infrastructure. We've just recently announced the NFCP, which is the National Fiberization and Connectivity Plan, which is our 5G rollout plan, led by our sister agency, MCMC, which is the regulator for the telco space. That's where we want to see a lot of investment from the government side go into IoT, robotics, automation, big data, AI, and we're building out the infrastructure for that. At the same time, we want to make sure we attract the right amount of talent, because when you attract new technologies, that talent probably does not exist in your country at that point. So if I were to look for some AI experts in Malaysia, I will not get enough to build an entire industry out of it, so we've got to make sure the right policies are in place to make it easy for people from these selected industries to come and have a job, build a company in Malaysia. Of course, attracting the right kind of capital, the right kind of investors, the right kind of conglomerates and international corporations to be able to deploy the capital in Malaysia is important. And with that, making sure that all of this is captured in realistic and practical regulations that make it easy for the businesses to consider being based out of Malaysia. Of course, at the end of the day, it also comes down to the end customers. We're very well aware that we're 37 million people. It is a large population for us, but in the global scheme of things, it's relatively large, relatively small market. So we've always positioned Malaysia really as a hub for you to be able to enter the ASEAN market and also service globally. Maybe on that, let me just touch a little bit our history as a ex or previous British colony means that the majority of our people speak English. The fact that we're multiracial, I'm Malay, my colleague is Indian, we have Chinese descendants in Malaysia, means that we also speak most of the major languages of the world, from Mandarin to Hindi, and of course, because we have next door Indonesia, we also speak Bahasa, which is very close to the Indonesian language. With that, we've realized that a lot of international companies come to Malaysia because you can set up an operation that can service multiple languages. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, my colleagues were in China, and the most valuable, I don't know which corn it is now, because they're like the most valuable unicorn, decacorn, but DanceBite, which owns TikTok, if you've heard of TikTok, actually set up an operation that has about 2,000 employees now in Malaysia, and the primary function of their office in Malaysia is content moderation, because they realize that they have content in all languages, and Malaysia is one of the countries that they can actually service and hire talent who are already living in Malaysia that can understand several languages. So our target has always been export, and to enable export, you have to bring in the right amount of investment, because with investment comes two things, money and expertise. So by and large, the two types of companies that we work with are creators of technology to set up largely manufacturing or business process outsourcing in Malaysia, and also users of technology. Again, that's to service some part of their global business being based in Malaysia, building upon the skills that we have from the population and the population size and the relative fluidity of our employment market. So where do we go from here? We realize now that as the digital economy evolves and no one really talks about ICT as an industry anymore, we also have to reinvent ourselves as an attractive investment destination. With a lot of the new technologies, whether it's IoT or drone or AI, we also realize that after you leave your research facility in Silicon Valley, or maybe your research facility in Seoul, you have to try it out in real-world conditions, which is why we've recently launched the Global Testbed Initiative, actually part and parcel of something that our Prime Minister envisioned also in the late 1990s, where if you were inventing a drone or AI technology in your part of the world, and you wanted to test it in a real-world environment, Malaysia will provide that for you. So the biggest challenge, if you, let's just say today you imagine you have a drone company, the biggest challenge is not actually to invent the drone to carry the payload. That is a challenge, but when you apply it to the real world, you get stuck with a whole bunch of regulations that were never designed for drones. For example, in Malaysia, when you want to take off in a drone, the same rules apply to you as when Korean Air takes off with a Boeing 747. Under our Civil Aviation Authority, it's the same amount of rules. That means that it's either very slow or cost prohibitive for a company to be able to do that readily. So what we commit to is to be able to harmonize the regulations, maybe even suspend the regulations for the test bedding purposes. And we believe that this is where we can attract a lot of companies to come in and play in this space, the new technology spaces, and see the real world applications and have a living lab concept while you test this out. So specifically on the Global Testbed Initiative, the first one that we're going to pilot, the first industry, is actually drone. And that we have a very real and very strong reason for this, which is obviously the market is huge for drone. It's just under $130 billion global market. But more importantly for us, it's one of the unique industries today where we have local companies, local Malaysian companies that have a leadership position. For example, Aerodyne, they're a top 10 drone company right now globally. Even though we had regulation restrictions in Malaysia, we had the talent that was interested in this industry. And right now, Aerodyne is existing in 19 markets all over the world, servicing everything from plantations to oil and gas sectors with their solutions. So we believe that this is a new dynamic that we can play, where in the original MSC vision, we were bringing in companies that brought us a lot of things, and then we were building with that. In the global testbed, especially with drone, we're going to be able to build together because we have some local Malaysian companies that are already at the forefront of these industries. So Malaysia, really time and time again, I think if you look in the data in the early 2000s, and still till today, we're a dragon factory. And we haven't been able to complete the entire value chain, but by and large, up till about the early 2010s, the most number of technology IPOs originated in Southeast Asia from Malaysian companies. Also with that, we have companies like Grab and iFlix, who have already gone global, that started in Malaysia. Now, we totally recognize that we're not able to do the whole value chain because at some point, one of the things that we lack is the late-stage funding for venture capital. So a lot of these companies do legally move out of Malaysia, but we're still proud of the fact that a lot of the know-how, the entrepreneurial spirit came from people who were from Malaysia and wanted to start and create a valuable company. So as we go forward and try to improve that, we realize that we can't do it alone. We, even at MDEC, as a government entity, rely largely on the ecosystem and the communities to organize, and where they can't self-organize efficiently, we try to bring them together. So from everything from physical spaces, like co-working spaces where companies meet, to also enterprise partners that they need to have access to. So everything from your cloud services to your hiring platforms in order for you to be able to attract talent, to also corporate partnerships. Because there are certain companies in Malaysia which are more open to innovation, and something that we've been advocating for many years in Malaysia, for them to adopt technology within their suite of services. So we've also realized that the type of companies that you bring in changes. Where in the 1990s and 2000s, we're talking to a Dell, to a Samsung, to a Sony. These are large corporations that we're trying to attract in. Today in the digital economy, company sizes are significantly different. You're no longer talking to a corporation that has 2,000, 20,000 employees trying to convince their senior management to come. Sometimes you're trying to convince a group of friends, 3 or 4 young people that are very creative and have a big appetite for technology. You're trying to bring them into Malaysia as a small group. So we've also launched the Malaysia Technology Entrepreneurs Pass, which allows young people, not young people, just anybody who's looking at technology, but a small team, to have a special visa that allows them to stay in the country as they start and grow the company. So everything is fairly straightforward. There are 2 tracks for this. Number 1, when they're really looking at an idea and exploring the market, they can stay for 1 year. And for somebody who's got a track record of building a business and we can take a bigger risk on, we give them a 5-year multi-entry visa for them to start building a company there. So we also recognize that the types of companies and how they grow today are very different than 20 years ago. Now, moving forward, we know that there's lots and lots of opportunities in how a country can grow. And we don't want to be stuck in a model of just repeating the model of growth of another country. I think a lot of the panel also brought this up today, a lot of people are trying to create the innovation that has been happening in Silicon Valley over the last 30, 40 years. They're trying to do that over a compressed time. But we have to recognize that we don't have the same history as Silicon Valley. We don't have the same situation as what the US had, which was the space race when we were trying to get to the moon. The space race, in fact, was the biggest catalyst for technological innovation in the US, not the need to create a high-tech or internet. The internet, in fact, was created because the US military and NASA wanted to try to get to the moon. So that gave birth to a silicon manufacturing industry, largely built on government contracts, that eventually led to your Sun Microsystems, which led to a Microsoft, which led to the Facebook and Googles of today. So knowing that you cannot repeat exactly the same pattern in the past, we then have to look into Malaysia and say, what's different about Malaysia, what's unique about Malaysia that can leverage the global trends which are happening now? Which brings me back to my first slide that I showed you before. We started primarily as an agriculture and of the biggest industries still today in Malaysia. And what we're looking at doing as deploying in the strategy is not necessarily inventing new technologies, but applying specific technologies, emerging technologies, into some of these sectors. How can we produce rice more efficiently? How can we automate manufacturing so that maybe we'll have a national car, but also we'll be able to be the manufacturing or call center for our global automotive makers? So knowing that, we look down at what's the transformation potential of a lot of the sectors. Financial services, oil and gas, manufacturing, wholesale and retail. That's where we feel a lot of adoption can come quite easily as long as we facilitate with the right business environment. But by and large, I think some of the largest bets that we can make is in our commodities markets. Agriculture, palm oil and rubber, palm oil continues to be a major contributor to our economy. If we can transform those industries by introducing new emerging technologies, it'll be a net positive effect to GDP. But we also understand that with this strategy, we create a very real problem. With the palm oil sector today, if you install a drone, you may be replacing 200 jobs. Where do those 200 people go? And that's the question that we ask ourselves in the Malaysian government every day. How do we rescale and upscale the labor force? Because the dynamics of this strategy is different than what we did 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we would bring a company in, they would train staff for the specific skills. Today, we're going to introduce a technology that will immediately remove jobs. So how do we then reskill that labor? Because it would make no sense commercially for the company to keep them. In closing, let me just share that one of our companies, Genting Berhad, recently for their plantations in Indonesia, used drone technology to spot forest fires. In any given day, if you had a human to do this job, he would be able to cover 5 hectares of land. But when you use a drone, in any day, you can actually cover 2,000 hectares of land. Immediately, you replace about 50 jobs. And that's a very real problem for Genting. And as much as we're excited about the pace of technology being adopted into these industries, we are mindful of the fact that we have to move very fast to reskill these people so that they can move on to better jobs. So building upon the success of our companies right now in Malaysia, we have everything from iFlix to Aerodyne, Forest to FusionX. We realize that the dynamics of the businesses are changing. We're constantly trying to evolve the Malaysian economy and strategy to something that fits within the wider global picture and to always become a hub or landing or entryway for companies into the ASEAN economy. And finally, let me close with saying that ASEAN as a trading bloc is fairly unique. We're 10 countries that have never fought a war with each other. We're 10 countries who are not united by a single set of policies. We're also 10 countries that largely this is an even though it's formal, it's not a binding agreement. Free trade is something that we facilitate. Of course, with South Korea, we have the APEC agreement. But all of our 10 countries together is, I think, the 7th largest economy in the world. We have the highest GDP of any economic bloc. So what we want to invest time into is trying to facilitate a lot of trade and trying to actually ease the business processes between the countries. One such initiative that we're trying to advocate for right now is the standardization of e-invoices. When you and I trade between Korea and Malaysia, we send each other an invoice over PDF. But that's not really an e-invoice, because depending on which system you use, if I use SAP and you use Oracle, there's an offline process that you do, and that takes time. And we realize that on average for business, that may take anything between 5 to 7 working days. But when I make a phone call from my number in Malaysia, Celcom, to your number, SK Telecom in Korea, you'd never care about the process in between. So we believe that we can achieve a similar process efficiency in just trade and starting with invoice, then we can exponentially increase the volume and efficiency of trade across markets. So we believe that at a G2G level, the next wave of innovation has to be where our countries start adopting similar standards to be able to facilitate trade. And we believe that a lot of these standards will be actually facilitated or catalyzed with the new type of technologies that we're seeing today. So in closing, I want to say thank you for having us today. I hope that Malaysia's story moving forward is always interesting for South Korea. We look forward to continue working with a lot of South Korean companies. My email's up there for anybody else who is interested to connect offline. And thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. 감사합니다.